Hi guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you've all had a good week and are looking forward to the weekend. In today's video I'm painting lesson 8 of the Watercolour Trip to Italy painting book I've been working through, and I'm really excited for this one as it's a beautiful scene of Lake Garda. This painting really caught my eye straight away as it's the first water scene we've done in this book, and I thought it was really interesting to see how the artist has interpreted the darker reference photo to produce a painting that is light, bright and full of life. So I feel like there is more to learn from today's lesson than simply copying from the reference photo. To capture the light on this painting and preserve the white of the paper, we'll also be using masking fluid, and make sure you watch till the end of the video today as I'd also like to get your thoughts on my plans for next week's video. So without further ado, let's get on with today's painting. As always, I'm masking off the 2 outline sketches with washi tape before reading through the first of our step-by-step instructions. So step 1 is all about the masking fluid, and we have to mask on the form of the highlights on the water using different sizes and shapes, with the smaller ones in the background. The masking fluid that came in this kit is really easy to use and has the added benefit that, unlike some masking fluids, is slightly coloured so you can see where you're putting it. Next we have to mask on the top of the boat and the float, and again using this squeezy bottle makes application really quite precise and easy. So with that done, we're already on to step 2, and the first of the instructions is to wash the sky and mountain area. Now there's 2 colours that we need to mix up, one for the top and one for the bottom, using a lot of water. So this is the wet in wet technique, and I start by mixing up the 2 colours before I start. The first of these 2 colours is a mix between Madder Lake Deep and Ultramarine. And as I've mentioned previously, there aren't any instructions or guidelines as to how much of each colour to mix, so I generally try and test these out and swatch them onto a piece of watercolour paper before I actually apply them to the painting. The next colour to mix together is cadmium red and cadmium yellow, and that's for the bottom half of the sky. Once those 2 colour swatches had dried a bit, it was easy to see that the colour I'd mixed to start with for the top of the sky wasn't quite right. So I did then add a little bit more Madder Lake Deep and have a bit of a tweak until I got a colour that I was more happy with. Using quite a lot of water, it was then time to add these 2 colours onto the paper. I'm also using my flat 1/2 inch brush again because it does make application a lot quicker and easier. I applied the top colour to the top half of the page, and then working from the bottom up to meet it, I then applied the second colour so that they'd mix in the middle. This enabled me to get a nice gradient and a seamless blend. The next of the instructions was to let this dry before we then wash the mountain with a 3 colour mix of ultramarine, yellow ochre and Madder Lake Deep. We can see how different this is on the artist's painting compared to the reference photo. Even at this early stage in the painting, it was starting to highlight how important it is to plan your colours and your colour palette for the whole piece before you even start. So with this more mauve colour mixed together for the mountain, I was ready to start applying it to my painting. So with the mountain all done, the next step was to pre-wash the lake area excluding the yacht. And the step after this was to wash the lake and the foreground with two different colour mixes using the wet in wet technique. So as I've started doing, I decided to make these two colours up first. This would mean that any washes I'd applied to the paper wouldn't be drying before I'd had time to apply the paint and take full advantage of the wet in wet technique. The first colour to mix together was a 3-colour mix of Madder Lake Deep, Ultramarine and Viridian. And this came out really quite green for the lake area, and when I matched it up against the artist's painting I wasn't very happy with it, so I mixed in some more ultramarine to try and get it back to being a bit more blue. However, when I swatched this colour out it had gone too blue, so I then ended up adding in a bit more Madder Lake Deep to try and get to the colour that I could see in the artist's impression, which was a bit more purpley. And it did take me a few attempts, but I got there in the end. Needless to say, I was quite pleased that I chose to pre-mix the colours before adding them to the wet paper, which would have dried by now. The second of these two colours that I needed to mix was again another 3-colour mix of Viridian, Cadmium Yellow and Yellow Ochre. Mixing this colour again took a few attempts because the initial colour that came out on my palette at least seemed to be very bright green and not at all like the green that was on the reference picture. It was at this point though that I did start to think that I wasn't just using them as individual colours on their own, I was actually layering them over each other and using them in the wet in wet technique. So when I put them together on my swatch paper, I decided that the mixes I'd got weren't so bad after all and set about adding them to the paper. First though, we needed to pre-wash it with some clean fresh water before adding the paint. So once the paper had been pre-wet as evenly as possible, it was time to add the first of those colours that we mixed up for the main part of the lake. I was quite glad with the colour as it laid down on the paper and tried to apply it as evenly, as smoothly as I could before then going in with the second colour whilst the paper was still wet. This second colour was just to be applied to the waves on the foreground. And despite my initial concerns that it was a bit too green, when mixed with that purpley colour of before, it didn't look too bad at all. So whilst allowing that to dry, it was time for the next step, which was to wash the shadow side of the yacht, mast and cabin using a 2-colour mix of ultramarine and yellow ochre. Again, getting the proportions of these two colours right did take a few attempts, as I was not only concentrating on getting the right colour, but also getting the value dark enough to act as a good contrast in the painting. But once I was kind of happy enough with the colour mix, I started to apply it first to the mast of the yacht. Now it's at this point in the painting that I should have been able to have seen a potential problem on the horizon, but I didn't, so I carried on painting the mast, the cabin and the shadow side of the boat. I do get to realise what the mistake is that I've made, but it's not for a few steps yet. So carry on watching and you'll see the moment that light dawns. The next step was to darken the yacht reflection using Viridian and Burnt Umber. For this paint mix, I really wanted to get a dark colour on the paper to act as a really good contrast and therefore add depth to the painting as a whole. In the past, some of these mixes have come up a lot lighter than they have appeared on the artist painting, so I did spend a little bit of time really trying to get that colour as dark as I could. I did like the colour as it laid down, but I still think it could have been darker still, so I'm going to try and improve upon that in my second attempt. So far as knowing where to apply the shadow underneath the boat, there were a few guidelines on the left hand side of the painting, but there wasn't much so far as where to put the shadow of the mast and that kind of thing, so a little bit of that was guesswork. With that done though, we had to let the paint dry before rubbing off the masking fluid. And this was the fun part, because despite having used a hairdryer for my drying, the masking fluid came off really well and didn't tear the paper at all. Sometimes when you've dried your paper with a hairdryer, it can almost cement the masking fluid to the paper and make removing it a lot more difficult, but I really didn't have any problems with this. So now we're on to step 3, and the first part of this was to darken the yacht window using a 2-colour mix of ultramarine and viridian. Because this is a very small area, I also decided to switch to the smaller of the 2 paintbrushes that came in the kit, which is a size 1 round. I also decided just to mix up a very small amount of paint so that I wouldn't waste any, because this was just a very small area to paint. Next, the instruction was to blur the edges of the mountain partly, so I went back to using the larger of the 2 paintbrushes and just applied it carefully to the outside of the mountain using some clean fresh water just to blur those edges a little bit. Next, we had to darken the front and rear edges of the boat using ultramarine and yellow ochre. This came out quite dark when wet on the swatch paper, but it did look fairly similar to the artist's painting, so I went with it knowing that it might dry slightly lighter anyway. I did decide to blend the edges a little bit using just some clean water to try and diffuse that harsh edge and make it look a bit more natural. Next, we had to wash the boat's skirting board with ultramarine, and I looked on the reference picture from the artist to see where to apply this and just used a very fine paintbrush, the smaller one from the set, just to use this neat with very little water to get a nice deep dark blue. Next, it was time to move on to adding some dark waves in the reflection using ultramarine and viridian and ultramarine and cadmium yellow. I didn't use much water in this mix to try and get a really concentrated colour for those dark reflections. I used the artist's image as a reference for where to apply these darker areas, and it also gave me the opportunity to darken up what I thought was a little bit light earlier on in the painting. The second colour mix for this step was to use ultramarine and cadmium yellow, and again I didn't use much water so I could get a really rich deep colour. The combination of both of these 2 colour mix for the shadow or reflection area underneath the boat helped to make a really nice deep green colour, and I applied them in a more of a random way so that it would look more natural. So with the lake area complete, it was time to move on to the yacht's door and mix in some cadmium red and some burnt umber to make that nice deep rich red colour. The door to the yacht is just a tiny little area of red to the left hand side of the cabin, as you can see on the reference picture, but I didn't want it to be too red, so mix in a bit more burnt umber so it wouldn't be too bright and look unnatural on the picture. The colour that we had to mix for the float, on the other hand, was slightly more bright red, so this was a mix of cadmium red and cadmium yellow. And again, even though it was just a tiny area, I wanted to get it right. I did mix in a bit of the colour that we'd mixed up for the yacht's door, because I think the cadmium red and cadmium yellow mix was quite orangey. So far so good, and we're on to one of the last few steps, and this was to wash the ropes, sail and handrails using a two-colour mix of violet and yellow ochre. But when I mixed this colour together, I wasn't entirely happy with how it came out. It was quite brown and didn't really match up with that on the reference picture. So I began to apply it on the rails before then deciding to go off plan a little bit and add in some of the green colours that I'd previously mixed on my palette to darken up the sails in that colour instead. I also decided to add some of this darker mixture to the areas on the side of the boat that hadn't been mentioned in the instructions. And having gone off track a little bit so far as the instructions were concerned, I moved on to the next one, forgetting the ropes and all the details from the last step. I then went on to add the bright part of the yacht using cadmium red and cadmium yellow in a very watery mix. I then added this dilute, very watery mixture to the top of the yacht. Notice how I still haven't added in the ropes, but I move on to the next step, which was to blur partly the rough edges around the lightest highlights on the lake. This was done using a clean damp paintbrush before going on to the last step, which was to cover those highlights partly using a bit of lemon yellow. I wasn't really quite sure where to add these, so I just used it sparingly on the area underneath the boat on the foreground of the lake. And this was where light dawned, because I realised that because I hadn't masked off the top of my painting, I'd got an area of mast that was just going really into the air, and I had nothing for the ropes to attach to. So I had to improvise and ended up drawing a longer mast so that I'd have something for those ropes to attach to. It was a bit of a shame, as I thought it had gone really well up until then, but there's always attempt number 2. So for attempt number 2, there were a couple of things that I wanted to improve upon, although I wouldn't have the same problem with the mast of the yacht this time because the outline sketch was printed higher up on this part of the paper. I did decide to mask off the area underneath the yacht though, so I wouldn't have the same problem in reverse. This was a bit of a blip in the first attempt, but I do think that generally the instructions seem to be really well laid out this time, so there weren't any issues with when to remove the masking fluid or when to allow the paper to dry and so on that I've mentioned in a few of the previous lessons. So I did really think that the error was on my part and nothing to do with the instructions. I think the main lessons that I learnt today from both of the attempts was more to do with how to view the reference photo. I really liked the colour choice and the palette that was used by this artist for this painting, and didn't change up much at all so far as that goes, but I did change the way that I painted the lake in the second attempt. Rather than going for a smooth even wash for the lake, I went for more of a textured look to the waves. And as much as I was glad that I changed it up and experimented a bit, I wasn't sure whether I liked it quite as much as the original attempt in the first place. Maybe it takes something away from the general overall calm, serene feel to the piece, but let me know in the comments which attempt you prefer. I do quite like how they both turned out, and I'm not really sure this week that I've got a firm favourite. This painting today though has inspired me to perhaps try something of my own outside of the painting book. I'm not a great photographer and have always thought that my photos would either be too dark, not focused enough, or wouldn't be suitable for use as a reference for a painting because of some other reason. But looking at the photo reference for today and the resulting paintings that we've come up with, I've realised that perhaps you don't need to have the perfect reference photo. I feel like my eyes have been opened to the possibilities of using photographs more as references rather than as something to copy exactly. I love the way that in this painting we've got such a different colour palette to the one that immediately springs to mind on first glance at the reference. You haven't got to copy absolutely everything from the reference photo, and that includes colour. You can leave parts out of it and you can add bits in depending on what composition and what feeling or emotion you're going for. And that's been really freeing for me because I generally try and copy things as they are, and if they don't come out exactly as the photo, then they're not a good piece of artwork. But maybe I feel a bit differently now. Maybe it's worth experimenting in a sketchbook, or even taking some paints out and having a go outside without any pressures or any rules or guidelines to stick to. I think I did still make a few improvements on my second attempt and felt a bit more confident to put in the lemon yellow on the horizon, as I didn't really know where to put it to start with. But that got me thinking about this book. This Trip to Venice book is a similar painting book to Italy, only it's a little bit harder. It hasn't got any step-by-step instructions, and it doesn't have the guidelines in the same way that the Painting to Italy book has. It does have some reference photos, but perhaps with my new outlook on things and my newfound confidence to try something different, I might be up for the challenge. I'd love to know what you think. Should I continue on with the Painting to Italy book, or should I risk it and try one of these new paintings? Let me know in the comments box. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you have. And here are some more videos if you've missed any from the previous ones. Thank you so much for watching. Take care and I'll see you soon. Bye.